In the long history of economic systems, few forces have stress-tested the machinery of a state with the brutal efficiency of a pandemic. The Roman Empire, even in its Eastern incarnation, projected an aura of permanence, its economic engine fueled by centuries of established commerce and taxation. Yet, in the mid-6th century, an invisible biological agent arrived that would not just kill millions, but would fundamentally break the fiscal architecture of the ancient world's last superpower. Now, let's open the historical ledger and analyze the economic blueprint this crisis left behind. Before the Great Shock, the Eastern Roman Empire under the Emperor Justinian I represented a system operating at peak complexity and ambition. The year is 540 AD. The Mediterranean is, once again, largely a Roman lake. Justinian's armies, led by the brilliant general Belisarius, have reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Ostrogoths. Finally, the plague created a severe labor shortage, which inverted the centuries-old power dynamic between landowners and workers. For the first time in generations, surviving peasants and artisans had leverage. They could demand higher wages for their labor, as there were simply not enough people to till the fields, build the aqueducts, or man the workshops. This market-driven recalibration of the value of labor was anathema to the rigid hierarchical Roman system. In 544 AD, Justinian issued an edict attempting to set a wage and price ceiling, forbidding workers from demanding and employers from paying more than the pre-plague rates. This was a direct state intervention to protect the interests of the landowning aristocracy, the class the state ultimately relied upon for what taxes it could still collect. This policy was, of course, almost entirely unenforceable. It was an attempt to legislate against the fundamental economic law of supply and demand. We see a striking modern parallel in this policy. It is a historical echo of the same state impulse seen after the Black Death in 14th century England with the Statute of Laborers, which also failed to suppress wage growth in the face of a demographic reset. All these policies, taken together, paint a clear picture. They were the actions of a powerful state apparatus applying its traditional tools of coercion, taxation, monetary control, and legal edicts to a problem that those tools were not designed to solve. The administration was fighting a fiscal war against a biological reality, and in the process, it was inadvertently accelerating the very economic decay it was trying to prevent. The fiscal mechanisms Justinian enacted were not a recovery program. They were a desperate, short-sighted battle for the state's survival. In the long run, these policies did not reverse the damage, but instead carved the plague's demographic impact into the permanent economic structure of the empire. The long-term consequences were profound, representing a point of no return. The fiscal hollowing out of the state became a chronic condition. The vast sums of predictable revenue that had funded the reconquest of Italy and Africa were gone forever. The Roman state, for the remainder of its thousand-year history, would never again possess the same level of centralized fiscal power. Its ability to field large, professional armies, to build on a monumental scale, and to project power across the Mediterranean was permanently diminished. The grand ambition of the Renovatio Imperii died with the plague's first victims. On the ground, the policy of enforcing tax collection on survivors for their dead neighbors' lands had a ruinous effect on the rural landscape. Small, independent farmers, the traditional backbone of the Roman economy, were wiped out, forced to abandon their ancestral lands to escape crushing debt. This accelerated a process of land consolidation, where vast estates, or latifundia, were bought up by the wealthy aristocratic elite who had the capital reserves to weather the crisis. The social and economic fabric of the countryside was fundamentally rewoven, becoming more feudal in character, with a dependent peasantry tied to the land of powerful local magnates rather than paying taxes directly to a distant emperor. The highly integrated, monetized, and complex economy of the classical world began to fracture, turning inward. The Justinian Plague was the catalyst for a systemic simplification, pushing the Mediterranean world away from the interconnected Roman model and towards the more localized, fragmented economic systems that would characterize the Middle Ages. This historical case study provides a stark and enduring framework for understanding a critical vulnerability inherent in all centralized states: the fragility of the tax base. The specific mechanisms of Justinian's Rome may seem ancient, but the core challenge is timeless and intensely modern. When a systemic shock be it a pandemic, a major war, or a climate catastrophe, suddenly decimates a nation's primary revenue streams, the state is forced into a crisis response. Consider the fiscal shockwaves of the COVID-19 pandemic in the 21st century. Governments across the globe witnessed a simultaneous collapse in tax revenues from income, sales, and corporate profits, precisely at the moment when they faced unprecedented demands for expenditure on healthcare and economic stimulus. Justinian's tools were crude, forcing tax collection, debasing coinage. Modern states have more sophisticated instruments at their disposal: quantitative easing, central bank interventions, and the issuance of trillions of dollars in sovereign debt. Yet, the fundamental dilemma is identical. It is the desperate calculus of bridging an immense and sudden gap between state obligations and evaporated income. The Roman response shows us that policies enacted during such a crisis, focused solely on the state's immediate solvency, often carry devastating and transformative long-term consequences for the society they govern. The story of the Justinian Plague is more than a chronicle of death. It is an economic blueprint of a system under extreme duress. It reveals how a biological crisis can trigger a fiscal crisis, forcing the hand of a powerful state and setting in motion changes that will echo for centuries. By deconstructing these historical mechanisms, we gain a more sophisticated framework for analyzing the pressures our own economic systems face today, recognizing the timeless patterns of shock, response, and consequence. This project, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, or the restoration of the Roman Empire, was a geopolitical vision underwritten by a formidable economic machine. The heart of this machine was a sophisticated and relentless system of taxation. For centuries, the Roman state had perfected the art of extraction. Its primary mechanism was the capitatio iugatio, a complex assessment system that linked tax obligations to both land, the iugatio, and the labor available to work it, the capitatio. This tax was not a vague tribute. It was a calculated, data-driven assessment levied on the agricultural powerhouse of the empire, the provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. The currency underpinning this entire structure was the gold solidus, a coin so stable and pure that it served as the reserve currency of the known world, from the forests of Germania to the markets of Persia. This financial stability gave the state in Constantinople immense leverage. It could fund a professional standing army, a sprawling bureaucracy, and monumental architectural projects designed to project imperial power, most famously the magnificent Hagia Sophia. Justinian's reign was one of immense expenditure. The state was not just a passive administrator, it was the primary economic actor, consuming vast sums in taxes and redistributing them through military salaries, bureaucratic wages, and massive public works. This system, while powerful, was rigid. Its equilibrium depended on a predictable and constant flow of two things: agricultural surplus and the human labor that produced it. The tax base was, quite literally, the population. The state's financial models, its budgets for wars and cathedrals, were all predicated on a simple, unspoken assumption that the number of taxpayers would remain relatively stable. In 541 AD, that assumption was shattered. The catalyst arrived not from a rival army, but from a merchant ship. It docked at the port of Pelusium in Egypt, the empire's granary. On board were rats, and on those rats were fleas carrying a novel pathogen, Yersinia pestis. This was the first historically recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. From the critical node of Egypt, the contagion exploded along the very trade routes that were the empire's economic lifeblood. If we were to map its trajectory, we would see the plague spreading along the shipping lanes, moving with the grain shipments to the imperial capital, Constantinople. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness in the city, described a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. At its peak, he claimed the plague was killing 10,000 people a day in the capital alone. While that number may be an exaggeration, the archaeological and paleogenetic evidence confirms a demographic collapse of staggering proportions. Estimates suggest that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the empire's population perished in the first wave alone. This was not just a human tragedy, it was a fiscal event horizon. The primary asset of the Roman state, its tax-paying population, was being liquidated. The immediate consequence was a systemic shock to the tax system. The officials, the exactores, who collected the taxes were dying. The farmers and laborers who paid them were dying in even greater numbers. Land, the other half of the capitatio jugatio equation, suddenly had no one to work it. Fields went fallow. The flow of revenue to the imperial treasury, which had been a powerful and predictable river, slowed to a trickle almost overnight. The entire economic equilibrium, which funded Justinian's grand ambitions, had been broken. The emperor, a man known for his tireless work ethic and absolute belief in the power of the state, was now facing a crisis for which there was no precedent: how to run an empire whose financial foundations had just been erased. Faced with a systemic collapse of the state's revenue stream, the imperial administration in Constantinople did not simply accept its fate. It responded with a series of fiscal and monetary policies that can only be described as desperate. The core problem was a structural deficit of terrifying proportions. The empire's costs were largely fixed. The army still had to be paid to guard the frontiers against the Persians and other threats. The bureaucracy, the lifeblood of Roman administration, still required its salaries. The grain dole for the capital's population, a key tool for social stability, was now more critical than ever. Yet, the income to meet these obligations had vanished. Justinian, the ever-pragmatic and ruthless administrator, initiated a series of measures not to alleviate the suffering of his people, but to save the fiscal integrity of the state itself. The first and most brutal policy was a direct attempt to defy demographic reality. Justinian commanded his tax collectors to maintain the established revenue targets for each district, regardless of the death toll. In practice, this meant that surviving landowners were held liable not only for their own taxes, but for the taxes of their deceased neighbors whose lands were now abandoned. This mechanism, known as the Epibole, was an old Roman practice, but it was now applied with a devastating lack of mercy on a pandemic-stricken population. If we visualize a provincial tax ledger from the time, we would see entire family lines crossed out. Yet their tax obligation, the iugatio tied to their land, was simply reassigned to the nearest survivor. This policy was a short-term patch that guaranteed a catastrophic long-term consequence. It created an incentive for farmers to abandon their own land, to escape an impossible and ever-increasing tax burden, leading to further agricultural collapse and state depopulation. It was a fiscal death spiral. The second tool was monetary manipulation. While the gold solidus was kept relatively pure to pay soldiers and foreign diplomats, the state began to deconstruct the value of the bronze and copper currency used by the vast majority of the population for daily transactions. The folies, a large bronze coin, began to be minted with less metal and at a lower weight, yet was still mandated to be accepted at its old value. This is a classic act of seigniorage, the profit a state makes by issuing currency. It is, in effect, a hidden tax. By debasing the coinage, the state could mint more coins from the same amount of metal, allowing it to pay its domestic bills, such as payments to state-run workshops. For the average citizen, however, this policy was a catalyst for inflation. Merchants, recognizing the lower intrinsic value of the new coins, would simply raise their prices for essential goods like bread, oil, and wine. The state was surreptitiously taxing the purchasing power of its own people to stay solvent. Third, with the traditional tax base shattered, Justinian's administration scrambled to find new sources of revenue. This led to the imposition of new taxes on trade and commerce, and the expansion of state monopolies. The most famous of these was the imperial control over the silk industry. After famously smuggling silkworm eggs from China, the empire had established its own silk production. Justinian quickly turned this into a state-controlled monopoly, with all profits flowing directly to the treasury. While ingenious, this policy demonstrates a fundamental structural shift. The empire was being forced to pivot from a system financed by broad-based agricultural production to one propped up by taxing the narrow choke points of commerce and luxury goods. This was a far less stable and less lucrative economic model,